Hi everyone, I'm Raj Kumar, President and Editor-in-Chief of DevX. This week we'll be breaking down the big headlines in global development and bringing in some top experts to help us do it. If you want to follow along with the stories we're talking about, check out devx.com and subscribe to our daily newsletter, The Newswire. There's a link in the description. Follow us along on Twitter and you can see many of the stories we're talking about today, and we'd love to hear what you think. This is This Week in Global Development.
I want to welcome this week David Ainsworth, our business editor. Hey, David.
Hey, Raj. Good to be with you.
Good to be with you, too. And Sasha Fisher is with us. Hi, Sasha.
Hey, Raj.
Good to be with you. And Sasha is, of course, the co-founder and co-CEO of Spark Microgrants. You've been with us before on the show, and it's great to have you back. And like I said, there's just so much to get into. And maybe we can just start. Sasha, you know the world of nonprofits, of fundraising very well. And we had a couple of big stories this week. One, analyzing MacKenzie Scott's giving, and another one looking at the big news of Melinda French Gates leaving the Gates Foundation. So maybe we could just start there. David, you want to give us kind of the highlight, the overview of what happened on the Melinda French Gates story, and then I'd love to hear Sasha's take on it.
Sure. So the big news this week is that Melinda French Gates has parted ways with the Gates Foundation, which she was heavily involved in, founded by her ex-husband, Bill Gates. And she's going to take several billion and move to give more, to work more in the field of women's rights and focus on giving more in that field, which has increasingly been where she's concentrated her philanthropy. The Gates Foundation has moved a little bit in that direction, but she obviously wants to kind of go a little further in that direction herself.
Yeah, this is big news in part because it was somewhat unexpected, right? I mean, they had said when they got divorced, I guess it was 2021, they talked about, a period that she would have to make a decision whether she would remain a co-chair. And I guess we've gone past that period. So it was somewhat unexpected, but the nature of it is similar to what was previously announced, and that she would take some additional resources from Bill Gates directly, not from the foundation's endowment, I guess $12.5 billion. And a lot of the questions around it have been answered and addressed by Mark Sussman, the CEO of the Gates Foundation. He put out a video and a note about it, but there are still some questions. But at this point, it seems likely that additional funding will go into a new philanthropic vehicle. She does have Pivotal Ventures, which is her existing philanthropic independent vehicle, separate from the Gates Foundation, but that is a LLC. It's set up as a company to do investments and among other things. And so there's a question of, what will the structure be? And some other questions too. Sasha, you saw this news, I'm sure. Any immediate thoughts?
I have to say, when I saw this, and I'm so glad you guys have been covering it, I was so thrilled. It made me think, yes, let this philanthropy money be free from the confines of how the Gates Foundation has been operating, which does incredible work and wonderful. And you see a lot of, both Melinda French Gates and MacKenzie Scott were in the headlines this week. I want more headlines like that generally. And you see both of them leading their philanthropic work with this impetus towards building agency for more people in the world. And you see the more traditional philanthropic groups, which have been very male dominated, not that there's not incredible allies for agency building work, being a little bit more control focused. So any more movement towards agency building approaches and philanthropy that's going to build agency in women and girls and communities and groups of people who could use that extra emphasis is just fantastic. And I think the only question should she be getting more money from the previous fund because her vision is going to be fantastic here and we need more of it. And I want more groups to start feeding in, just like Buffett put money into the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I would love to see other philanthropists putting in and doing more collaborative efforts on what she may do next, which I'm sure will be fantastic and still focused on agency building and letting people have the control to make decisions in their own lives, not telling them sort of what to do, which is a prescriptive traditional model. So I'm just thrilled by it.
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective, Sasha. A few things you said there I think are fascinating. One is you're so right that many foundations are both male-dominated and control-oriented. I think there's at least some really strong correlation there, if not causality. And you're right that this, especially MacKenzie Scott, I mean, she's far off on the spectrum in terms of her willingness to just simply trust the organization she's giving to with really no strings attached. But I guess you're right. There is a potential here that this funding to Melinda will free it in a way and allow it to do something really different than what the Gates Foundation is doing. Certainly, some of the speculation based on her comments, both her comments, through Mark Sussman when he announced this, but also her comments on the stage at the Global Inclusive Growth Summit, where we were media partners this just a month ago or so, where she talks a lot about kind of the legal and political environment facing women. And it does seem like there will be more focus, potentially anyway, on politics writ large, and that having both Pivotal Ventures and maybe another philanthropic arm, that she'll be doing more around electing women candidates, around reproductive rights, around a lot of the issues she's been passionate about and pushing for a long time inside the Gates Foundation. But now she'll have this more independent vehicle to do that. I think it's probably also fair to say that if it weren't for her, the Gates Foundation probably never would have focused on gender equality as much as it has in the last several years. And so maybe that's a question mark too, is how will that look vis-a-vis the work she's going to be doing separately? But really fascinating thoughts there. David, maybe you can give us any thoughts you got. I'd love to hear them. And also tell us a bit more about this MacKenzie Scott story so we can continue on this philanthropy theme.
What fascinates me here is the importance of how money is given away. It's obviously fantastic that these people are giving away huge sums of cash. But what's really revolutionary about this, about Melinda French Gates, about the Gates Foundation as well, and about MacKenzie Scott, is that they're giving money away in a way that the people who are receiving it are asking for. I had a couple of chats at the Skull World Forum where I was recently, and I bumped into you there, Sasha, with people who are talking about what frustrates them about philanthropy. And they said basically when the money is given away over a short period of time, there's a lot of red tape, it's difficult to access. People are given the money and then told what to do with it. They're told what they can spend it on. It's not unrestricted. It makes it very hard for them to actually achieve the change that they want to change. And you talked about agency, Sasha. And I think that's really the key thing. This is money given away in a way that puts the grantee in charge. And that's kind of MacKenzie Scott's whole thing. And that's what we saw this week. Some new figures are out. She gave away $2.2 billion last year. She gave away a lot of it in the United States, but she gave a lot of it away in the rest of the world as well. She gave away some transformational unrestricted sums up to $25 million to people. And she said, basically, kind of do whatever you like with it. What we hear from philanthropists is that this is shaking them up. They're thinking hard about whether they need to be kind of getting with the game and changing the way that they give money away. But so far, they're struggling with it. Progress has been slow, and we're not seeing a lot of other people kind of following her footsteps.
Yeah, it is really quite remarkable how she's done this. And it does raise a question, which is a similar question people are asking about Melinda French Gates. Pivotal Ventures has been just focused on the U.S. And initially, MacKenzie Scott's giving was very much focused on the U.S. and has over time included more funding overseas, although it still is a minority of the funding she's giving. So there's a kind of a question for both of these philanthropists about going forward, how much what percentage of the giving is going to actually focus overseas versus domestically in the United States. So that's an interesting question to follow. But the other thing is just the degree to which MacKenzie Scott is so different from most philanthropists. I mean, she barely made a noise when she came on the scene. She did not, there weren't big announcements and press releases and events. She has stayed very quiet. She has stayed completely true to what she said in her very initial giving pledge statement, where she said, I'm going to give away the money. I think she said something like until the safe is empty. And she has been doing that. Most philanthropists are pretty slow. They want to have a real strategy in mind. They want to be cautious. They want to be very prescriptive, as Sasha has indicated. She's really lived up to what she said, just writing very large checks in large quantities very quickly. She's really not slowing down. And there is a question, of course, of will she kind of continue to give at this level and therefore deplete her resources in the next 3 to 5 years or so, depending on the rate she does it. Or will she start to make smaller grants? Will she follow up to the same organizations who've already received grants and give them follow-on grants? How will this work exactly? There are questions that are live about it, but I think the analysis that we did this week really just is stark when you realize what she's done and how different it is. The scale of it is really only rivaled by the Gates Foundation, and the approach is truly different than Gates, which is so much more focused on having a strategy and being data-driven and being much more prescriptive. Sasha, what are your thoughts? I don't know if you've taken a grant from the MacKenzie Scott Foundation yet.
Not yet. Let's hope one day. I do want to uplift two of the things, both of these philanthropists that we're talking about I think, have had an eye on and are doing intuitively that a lot of the other foundations out there could be looking at and starting to adopt. And sometimes there seems to be this tension between being, we use data driven almost as a cover, or strategic as a cover for being thoughtful about what works with complex data. And so that we don't let people have ownership and decision-making authority over how the resources are done. And we make philanthropy very prescriptive. And the data actually shows, if you look across regions, across geographies and sectors, the number one thing that matters for project impact and sustainability is how engaged are the end users. And so when you decentralize philanthropy and let community members, mothers and fathers in a village make their own decisions over that capital, you actually do get better gains. And so it's a little bit ironic that in philanthropy, we keep saying, oh, we need to make the decisions for poor people because we have the data and we can look at it and review it and decide what's most effective. Whereas actually a lot of those solutions are things that end up being quick fixes, which are also can be important to do. Don't not do those. But there are things like, that are direct delivery of a bed net or something easy to understand. You get gains for 2 or 3 years, and then you fall back to baseline, basically, is what a lot of the research shows. Whereas if you let community members have control over the decision-making of the capital or your grant partners, as MacKenzie Scott and Melinda French Gates, I believe, is doing, you actually do end up getting better gains. You in some cases, if you give a grant, for example, directly to a village, research shows that you get 10 plus years of persistent gains. That is a lot better than 2 or 3 years. And this has been proven across some of the most complex regions, including Afghanistan, where even after the Taliban takeover, the community-driven initiatives where community members had decision-making, those are still persisting. That's pretty remarkable. So I think we need to uplift what both of them are doing, and that other philanthropic groups that are a little bit more control-oriented could get their own goals met better by letting go a little bit of the decision-making authority.
Yeah, it's a fascinating point, and obviously it's a big debate, and part of it comes down to what is the donor intent? And I think the reality is lots of donors, and you can see this with donations to universities, they still do a lot of this for credit, right? They want their name on the door of the building or on the graduate school or what have you. They want the big splashy ribbon cutting, and control is sort of connected to that idea of credibility and credit. And it's hard for donors to sort of say, you know what, I don't actually know the right answer here, but I trust that there is a local organization led by a local leader who's been doing this for a really long time, and they probably can figure this out better than I can and maybe be more cost effective and sort of do all the things you said. But to do that, they have to be willing to give up some of the credit and give up some of the grand strategy that a lot of foundations find themselves focused on. And you see a lot of foundations that are in this kind of never-ending strategic planning cycle. They have one plan, and then the next year they're working on a new strategic plan, and grantees are exasperated, just waiting to read the tea leaves and find out what their new strategy is going to be so they can adapt their proposals to try to get some of that funding. It really is a kind of dysfunctional system in a lot of ways. And yet it's where lots of the growth is in global development, right? For the kind of work you do, Sasha, like, the traditional aid organizations, the bilateral aid agencies, they're doing more and more humanitarian work. Their budgets are being constrained in many cases. And so a lot of people are looking to philanthropy for the future, but we have to face the fact that philanthropy has these really significant challenges in how they even think about their work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder even if we don't need to think about it as a zero-sum credit game, right? Where, like, if you allow for people to make their own decisions in their own lives and believe in that you don't have to give up on feeling good about the fact that you are engaged in that way or part of a movement that's shifting institutions and capital flows in a way that enables one day every village, every neighborhood to have that decision making, right? And that can be something that can be shared. I think power is not a zero-sum thing, nor is Yeah, nor is sort of like how we feel or our energy that we're putting into this work.
Yeah, if I could jump in on that, right? Like, a couple of things really occurred to me there. A couple of conversations I've had just recently. One was with a local leader who was based in Kenya, and I asked him, how much money would you give back for $100,000 of unrestricted funding you could do anything with? And he said, maybe $1 million, maybe $1 million. I'd maybe give back $1 million to get $100,000 of unrestricted funding. That sounds ridiculous, right? But basically, people really like to be in charge of their own destiny. And that must make sense, mustn't it? Everybody is an expert in their own needs. Why are we sitting there far away from them and saying to them, we think you should spend money on this? Why we think you should spend money on that? It can't make sense. But what's curious to me is, why is it so hard, do you think, to actually persuade philanthropists to do this? Obviously, part of the reason is ego. They want to keep the credit. But do we think that's all it is? I don't know.
Well, I think there's a few different motivations involved. I mean, in many cases, you're talking about people who earned the money through business. You know, maybe they're on Wall Street or Silicon Valley, they've made a fortune. And it's probably just human nature to think that they were the main reason that fortune was created, and that whatever they touch turns to gold, and they've got, you know, real capabilities. And if they could only apply those to the field of trying to eliminate global poverty, they will come up with something no one else has before, right? And I think it's understandable that people might have that perspective given that background, and it is their money. And so I think there's a sense of like, let me just study these issues, I'll figure it out, and then I'll make a decision, I'll find the answer, the silver bullet, and I'll chase it. And of course, this is a gross generalization, and it varies a lot, but there are plenty of cases like this. And I think at least it's one reason why you have so many people who've signed the giving pledge, 225 or something like that, but very few have really begun giving their funds in a significant way. And we end up talking about the same foundations over and over, Gates being the best example, because they are actually in the present day extremely philanthropic. Whereas many others, you know, have created foundations, have made pledges, have talked about it, but the amounts they're giving as a share of their net worth is really very small. And I think part of it just comes down to this thinking that, well, I've got to figure out what to do first. I've got to solve the problem. I've got to hire McKinsey. We're going to come up with a strategy. We've got to sort this out, and then we can give large sums of money away. And I think, you know, what Sasha's saying to some of these people sounds maybe counterintuitive, which is, no, you actually don't need to figure this out. It's been figured out. It's being figured out all over the world, all the time, in local communities by local leaders. And you just need to, you know, give them a chance. And as you say, David, maybe even the amounts could be a lot smaller. Even as is in the name of your organization, Sasha, micro grants might be good enough in many cases, but still the flows, to me, other than a few noteworthy philanthropists, still remain quite small. And I think it's some connection around these kinds of motivations for donors. I don't know how you feel about it, Sasha, as you go out there and try to make this case to all kinds of foundations.
Yeah, you know, something that we've experienced, and thanks for noting that we are directly engaged. Spark Microgrants does provide direct village grants and facilitation alongside it to make sure that women and men, young and old, are included in the decision-making process there. So it's something that's very near and dear to us. You know, part of this is just what is best practice and what have we normalized as what works in the world. A lot of times when we talk about and the work that we do, people say, well, why does it matter that people show up to the village meeting and that women are engaged in the decision-making process? Isn't that just a little bit inefficient that you're having these meetings before somebody's deciding how to put the money into a business? And I think part of this is, you know, the appreciation for a new set of things that matter. What matters is not just capital, like are people making more money? That matters a lot. That is a very important metric to be measuring. Alongside that, you know, I think we also care about, are women-headed households doing better off? We know that when more women are participating in village meetings, the decisions are benefiting more of the families at the village level. And, you know, I don't think we need really to make the case, but institutions are governed better when you have greater diversity of who's in those institutions making decisions. And that's something that the world is grappling with right now. We have a lot of elite domination from the village level, a handful of local men making decisions, right, all the way to the global level. And so imagining a new way for that to work that feels good to all of us, feels safe for everybody, and like a tangible opportunity, I think is so possible for us to do. And the other piece of this, so I'm appreciating that element of like, let's let a new body of work of like what is best practice emerge in our world, and let that be shared amongst, co-created with many different partners. And then there's the other piece that I think a lot of times donors are taught to find a product that they want to solve for, like a specific sector. And I find that actually people tend to be more aligned with their values. They want to make decisions based on their value set. Most people are actually very values aligned with the idea of agency. If you've built a business yourself and you've created that, you know what ownership means. You know what that meant to your own business's success. And so that makes sense that community members should also, and around the world, should have the decision-making power and ownership over their own local businesses. So, I think it's actually not so far apart. It's how do we open the space to imagine that and align with the values that are already there and line up with each other.
I love that hopeful perspective, and I agree. Like, we can get there. If you can unlock this, there's enormous potential, and there's so much money on the sidelines, and it has a lot of benefits versus, say, government funding. In that, in theory, private philanthropy can take all kinds of risks and can do things that the government can't do, and so there should be a lot of opportunity here, but it's slow going, and we do need to reframe it. And I know a lot of nonprofit leaders like yourself, Sasha, are really thinking about how to do that and how to tap into this next wave of philanthropic wealth that should be coming onto the scene.
Are you interested in the intersection of business and social impact? Do you want to know how corporate sustainability, ESG, impact investing, and more can contribute to development finance? My name is Adva Saldinger. I'm a senior reporter at DevEx, and I've been reporting on these issues for nearly a decade. I'm the author of DevEx Invested, our free weekly newsletter dedicated to development finance. Every Tuesday, we explore how companies, investors, and market mechanisms are reshaping the world of development finance. Visit devex.com/newsletters and join us on Tuesdays.
It reminds me of our conversation about another story we had this week, which relates to the same kind of issue. How do you get money and give agency to local organizations? But in this case, through USAID and all of its work to localize. David, maybe you can tell us a little bit about this story from our colleague, Alyssa Miolene.
So this is a long-standing issue with kind of people who are bidding for USAID work. What they've often tended to do is include smaller local subcontractors in the bid in order to make the bid look attractive, what some people here in the UK call bid candy. And then afterwards, once they've won the business, it turns out that they don't have as much work for those small subcontractors as they said they were going to do. And a campaigning group called Unlock Aid, who we've talked to a lot here at DevEx, have done some really good work, kind of shedding light on some of the practices of the large legacy bidders who've won a lot of USAID's work and have kind of campaigned very effectively for change. They're talking about setting up a glass door for primes to give people the ability to report when this behavior happens, when you work with a prime and either they don't treat you very well, or they don't pay you very well, or they don't offer you the work that they promised they were going to work, and to give smaller subcontractors more agency to have a more equal relationship with some of the big legacy organizations which win so much USAID work. We know that there's sort of 10 or 20 organizations who are winning a really significant portion of USAID, all of USAID's dollars, and have a lot of control over the market. And Unlock Aid are doing some really good work to try and redress that balance.
Yeah, Sasha, I don't know if you find yourself in this position. I don't know if you've ever subcontracted like this, or if you know of others. I think you're still based in East Africa, if I'm right. So you may know a lot of other local organizations there. What do you think about this broader theme? Is it something you hear about?
Oh, wow. It's such the topic of I think USAID is extremely hard to work with for organizations, and efforts to try to make that flow better are great. And Unlock Aid is doing some fantastic work here. I think there's part of the challenge is that this is a more of an institutional challenge within USAID, trying to grapple with the very thing we were just discussing around control orientation, of which is sort of a mandate from Congress, and letting there be greater agency in their partners and end users ultimately in how that capital is used. And so, it's an interesting fight also at the moment, because for USAID, USAID is always under attack. And so we want to preserve that USAID exists. And we actually want more money going to USAID. And at the same time, figure out how to make it easier for organizations to not have to conform to the existing system, but actually get the support from USAID that allows them to have their own vision for their work and be responsive to the communities that they're serving. And that's really the largest challenge here. And that, multiple administrators have been trying to work on this. And I think there is a path forward, but that is a hard one.
It's a really hard one. And you hinted at, I think what has been a tricky balance for advocates in this space, which is that there's a lot of things they want to see USAID do differently. But on the other hand, they don't want to undermine the very agency that they rely on and that they want to see grow. And it's very tricky. So, you've got a situation for USAID where there are plenty of members of Congress who are big skeptics of the agency and of foreign assistance in general. It's obviously become a much more politicized issue in the American Congress than it's been in probably 2 decades. And so there's a sense of, well, if we highlight the negatives too much, maybe opponents of the agency will use it. It's really tough. And so what Unlock Aid is doing here is fascinating. And they've been a bit more aggressive, I think, on this point than other advocacy groups have. And they've been seemingly a little bit more willing to push in public the agency. And this initiative, we'll see how it develops, but it could come up with a lot of great fodder for campaigners and reformers who care about USAID. Might also come up with some good fodder for those who really don't. But theoretically, we're going to hear directly from local organizations on some of their experiences going through exactly what you said, David, being seen as bid candy, being used effectively, and it'll be interesting to see what they say.
Yeah, for sure. This is something that these guys have, you kind of hinted at this, Sasha. These guys have complained about this a lot. When you talk to small nonprofits consistently, their kind of relationship with the larger funders, with INGOs, with large implementers, is something that has been a constant kind of thorn in their side. And so I think they're going to have plenty to say on this subject, if I'm honest. It'd be really interesting to see what they do say.
Yeah. Well, on this theme of how politicized aid has become in the United States, it's really a global story, but in the U.S. it's really quite stark. We had a piece this week, David, maybe you can just tell our listeners about, related to Scott Nathan, who is the CEO of the Development Finance Corporation, who testified in Congress this week.
Yeah, and again, this is a really interesting story, this one. Scott Nathan went off to Congress to testify, to talk about the work that his agency is doing. And he essentially got called out on having a woke agenda. If the agency goes too far down the Biden administration's woke agenda, it will jeopardize the agency's bipartisan support. I'm not sure necessarily that most people in the development sector would see DFC as having a woke agenda particularly. They would see it as kind of quite middle of the road, I think, in terms of typical development values. But this kind of maybe throws up a little bit of a problem here, that they're kind of pursuing things that might seem relatively uncontroversial to people working in aid is often seen, particularly kind of on the right of American politics, as something really controversial, something that should be challenged. And I think kind of walking that tightrope, staying true to the values that exist in the community, whilst also negotiating with the political paymasters, is a challenge, and it could obviously develop into much more of a challenge depending on who wins the next election in the US.
Yeah, it's a great point, great way to read it. You can see in the story the kinds of things that are being alluded to as potentially woke, quote unquote, are things like gender equity and climate mitigation. Not exactly radical ideas, certainly from a global development perspective. And yet, politically, maybe they're hot buttons now. Now, what we've seen in prior administrations in the United States is this political issue has kind of gotten worse over time. I mean, this was an issue even when George W. Bush was president. He was, a huge, ultimately one of the biggest success stories in terms of the total volume of foreign assistance. But even then, there was debate over some of these somewhat more political issues, and so you could see people changing their language, but maybe not changing the underlying work. And maybe that's really all it's a question here. That they'll, instead of calling things gender equality, they'll talk about women and families as an example of something I've heard people discussing, a new way of framing the same work. Or instead of climate, maybe talking about natural resources, So maybe this is just a language question and it's just a little bit of a political fray, and this is how agencies will adapt to it. Or maybe it's more of a fundamental threat. And so we did have, as the story talks about, other members of Congress, and it mentions in particular Joaquin Castro, who is a Democrat from Texas, and he basically had the opposite point of view, which is, hey, let's be careful that DFC doesn't lose its focus on development. The DFC is sort of caught because, on the one hand, the political support for them is largely based on a bipartisan view that the U.S. needs to counter China, and that DFC is the best tool for doing that. But on the other hand, once you go below the China question, then people on one side will say, well, we want to make sure DFC still has a development mandate. And perhaps there's some on the other side who are now saying, well, we want to make sure that development mandate actually is not too woke, and it needs to be more focused on foreign policy demands of the United States. So it's an interesting tension that they find themselves in as an agency that was created, during the Trump administration and with bipartisan and a lot of Republican support. Sasha, I don't know if you saw that piece, but I'd love to get your thoughts on this in general.
Yeah, it's such an interesting one. I mean, we're politicizing so many things that don't, it's a political tactic, I suppose, to make these politicized things that don't need to be politicized. And we've seen attacks on a range of different aid institutions from folks saying, you can't talk about inclusion or diversity, equity, and inclusion. At the heart of development work is about inclusion, that all people, all humans should have the right to a good, basic needs met and a life with dignity. And so it's, that is a core part of the work. and yet these words are being politicized, whereas the values, I think, underlying them, most people agree on, and still agree on. And of course, there will be outliers there, but for the most part, I'm really proud of the development sector actually for often being at the forefront of caring about these things and upholding the right set of values. And that is, separate from a sort of extremist woke, something that's an anti-woke sort of agenda. I think is very separate from these things. So I think it's unfortunate that the development sector gets brought into things. It's so tiny. It's such a small part of the U.S. budget that it's smart for people to play with it because you can use it for divisiveness, but then it's also sort of like so small. So I think it's unfortunate that it gets caught in these conversations because it's already doing the hardest work out there. And now it has to take on these challenges as well. But I hope that the institutions stay firm in the work focused on development, and in order to achieve development, making sure that it's working for all the different people who exist on this planet, who are women and men, non-gender binary, of all different backgrounds and experiences. So there was just one other piece on the, we often hear very gendered language in the development space. Even I said earlier, female-headed households. This is a really classical term of like a household that doesn't have a man in it. But that sort of presupposes that men are the head of the household, which I think is like not something that we would always, that's why are we taking that for granted that is the way it is versus like there are two people heading a household. And, sometimes there's one member who's heading it, and that could be a man or a woman, or it could be somebody who's non-gender conforming. And, like that language, I think, does have a slippery slope to it because there's a very strong campaign right now against women and against the LGBTQI community. And that's building. And we do need to be careful to not somehow slip into supporting that language. So when, they say switch the language to women and families, you could also have men and families. There's a number of variations there. We want to make sure we don't slip into an area where we're actually, we're not acknowledging those challenges.
It's a great point, and it's something I've heard a lot of leaders in this space struggle with, particularly when they're faced with administrations that are on the opposite side of the political spectrum, and they say, well, look, if we change our language, if we don't talk about climate as much and we talk about energy instead, which was done, I think, during the Trump administration by some organizations, well, it will let us continue to get the funding and still do the same work. So what's the harm in that? But the truth is, we all know that the language can really matter. And some of it's at the heart of what development even is, which is a fight for rights for people. So if you give in, it's exactly as you say, it can become this slippery slope where maybe the funding in the short run is preserved, but in the long run, you're actually harming the very objective you set out for. So it's a really challenging situation that a lot of global development leaders find themselves in currently to some degree, but depending on the election results this fall in the United States, could become a much more urgent issue that people will have to grapple with. David, I want to see if you have a last thought here before we wrap up.
A couple of things occur to me there. One is I spoke yesterday with leaders of European civil society, and they're kind of wrestling with that problem right now that you were highlighting, that we're seeing cuts across the board in a number of European countries, the UK, France, Germany, Sweden, and the EU itself, all cutting budgets, or at least the EU's kind of changing its budgets to focus a little less on development causes. And they're trying to work out, do we fight against this? Do we stand up and speak out? Do we say this is bad, stop doing it? Or do we play the game? Do we take the inside track? Do we try to work out what motivates the people who are saying we don't think aid is as important, and kind of get inside their head and argue with it from their point of view? And it's not really, it maybe that way, that second way is a better way of kind of hanging on to a little bit more of the budget, but you're not being as true to yourself. And is it more important to take an instrumentalist view and get the cash to the people that you're trying to help? Or is it more important to take a rights-based view and stay true to yourself? And the interesting one last thing on the kind of left versus right thing, it's interesting that the more right-wing political parties are often very supportive of aid, but they take, as I was just saying, they're a much more instrumentalist position. They're much less keen on what you talked about right at the start, Sasha, agency. They kind of say, obviously, we have to help people, but we will decide what help they need. We will decide how they need help. We're the people in charge, and we're going to go over there and we're going to give them whatever they need, and then they can take it and they're going to say thank you. And that is, I think, a difficult pill to swallow for some people. So as far as I can see, these challenges are only going to get worse in Europe in the next couple of years. There's a number of right-wing governments in charge, and it will be obviously very much open to debate how much of a challenge it is in the United States, depending on who wins the election.
I just want to double down. I see this less as a left and right issue and more of an institution or anti-institution issue. And there's a lot of great Republicans who have been always backing U.S. foreign aid, and it is fantastic. And I think it's the one place that Republicans and Democrats have historically always come together, and that should continue. And let's, instead of playing somebody else's game, how do we develop a new game that works for the objectives of all people, meeting their basic needs and living with dignity. So yeah, just appreciate your comments there, David and Raj. This all has been fantastic.
Yeah, I appreciate those comments too. To close us out, Sasha, obviously, if you look at the work of USGLC as an example and the recent supplemental funding that came through Congress, including significant funding for humanitarian response, there has been this unlikely coalition that's included faith leaders, that's included military leaders, business leaders, as well as the development community that has, for a couple of decades now, really preserved a strong investment in these kinds of issues. And it's not as though that battle is lost. It's still an ongoing fight, and we don't necessarily have to assume it's lost and everything is just reverted to a left-right continuum. And I know there's a lot of people, yourself included, who are working every day to try to ensure that we stay true to what the right values are and to the work that we know really matters and that works around the world. So it's great, as always, to have you here in this conversation, Sasha Fisher, David Ainsworth, and all of you who have been following along. This has been This Week in Global Development. If you missed some headlines this week, make sure you subscribe to the DevX Newswire, and we'll be here next week. See ya.
Thanks, Raj. Thanks, David. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks very much, guys. Thank you.
This has been This Week in Global Development. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe using the link in the description. To get even more coverage and analysis on the most pressing development issues of the day, become a DevX Pro member by going to devx.com/membership and signing up. Thank you for listening, and see you next week.